So now we're going to expand the coordination. We're going to talk about dynamical systems perspective. This is a perspective that I deal with my research, but so we'll talk about how oscillators or different effectors work together in these theories based on dynamical systems. Now, this is the idea that things are in phase or anti-phase. They use a degree, typically 0 degree, meaning that it's in phase, anything going away from 0, going towards the positive negatives, or 180 is anti-phase. And it starts with the finger tapping concept. And what I want you to do is think about this and try this on the table. You put both fingers on the table and you lift one and tap while one stays on the ground. While the other one is coming down, you lift your other finger and so you're tapping not in sync with each other, but alternating. And so you're probably doing it at a nice slow pace. And then what I want you to do is continue to tap as you start to speed up a little bit. And at some point you transition from being in this anti-phase motion where one's going up, one's coming down, to now they both transition into going the same motion, so now they're in phase. So this finger tapping goes along the lines of showing that eventually there's some sort of position or transition that causes our body to go into phase in certain aspects, and some aspects of motion. And that's when you're trying to sync up to opposing limbs that are doing the same task. It's easier for us to be in phase than it is anti-phase. And of course, like, so when we're walking, it's kind of hard to do because each leg is moving in the opposite motion of each other. But the idea is that it's easier for us to switch from an anti-phase to an in-phase, and from an in-phase to an anti-phase, and going on that direction. So that's when I talk about which direction is more difficult. Our body prefers to switch from anti-phase to in-phase rather than switching from in-phase to anti-phase, and these finger tapping and these timing between things that are more of a symmetry in the motion. So based on this self-organization theory by Haken, Kelso, and Bunz, and it's called the HKB model. It's the idea that these two coupled oscillators in a system behave in this preferred state, in the physical state over time, and it's changing back and forth, right? So these are some terms that I think I want you to understand and know, and this is a thing where sometimes things can be in bistable position, and that's at these lower velocities, the task can be performed well, both in phase and anti-phase. And think back to that finger tapping task. When you were going slower, you could do it well in both in and anti-phase. Some people are better coordinated and don't have the ability to maintain other ones, but for the most part, that concept is bistable. Now, there's also the monostable, which that you tend, as you increase to a higher velocity, you want to switch from that anti-phase to the in-phase because your body prefers that pattern. It's easier to coordinate those two coupled oscillators. So this term bifurcation is this nonlinear transition from that anti-phase to the in-phase, and it's very abrupt, and you tend to be able to visually see it. Now there is some sort of control parameter, and the control parameter is some outside agency that's responsible for creating this transition. And for this, the control parameter is the velocity. You're increasing velocity, and that's your control parameter. And at some point you reach a critical period, and the critical period is at the velocity at which your body is put into this bifurcation because it prefers to be monostable at that velocity. And so it's that point of destabilization of the anti-phase pattern where your body no longer is feeling very good or bistable, and instead it's monostable. Therefore, you have this abrupt change or bifurcation due to your control parameter, which is the velocity. Going forward, as we're trying to do the timing of interlimb coordination, the preferences can be summarized into a spatial and timing component. And there's really two general categories, the egocentric preference and the directional preference. And the egocentric preference is basically you take the two limbs and they're going away and toward the center of any plane of motion. So the idea is if you take both of your arms and they come together towards the midline and then they go away. So you're coordinating these to and fro in this idea where they both are doing a sinusoidal path, but they're in the opposite direction. And then you also have the directional preference where you're taking them and they go the same direction along any plane, right? So this egocentric is to and fro, and think about the directional as they go in the same pattern of motion. Where if you look at the egocentric, the spatial and timing, they're both going through the same phases, but they're going to and towards and away from each other. And so this egocentric preference in phase is dominant over the directional preference of the antiphase. So up until this point, much of the self-organization theory and coordination was done unconsciously, right? So without the intention or attention on it. And it was basically done through the spatial and frequency component or temporal oscillations, and where the body preferred to be in this in-phase or antiphase. There is also the component or the idea that with intention or the intention, we have the ability to create a stable or a destabilized movement pattern. And it's the idea that we can consciously switch from in-phase to antiphase, but it takes us longer. If we are in in-phase mode, it's going to take us longer to switch that antiphase than if we consciously wanted to switch from the antiphase to an in-phase in this process. And it's because, again, it's our preferential. We prefer to be in this stable environment of in-phase versus being in this unstable environment of being in an antiphase situation. So therefore, the in-phase pattern restabilizes us faster than that anti-phase environment does. So here we go. With the intention, it creates this destabilization of the current pattern, and therefore it destabilizes the facilitations, and that transitions us to the new pattern. If we have to create a new pattern, we can do it through intention rather than doing it subconsciously. It's going to be more difficult if we want to get to an antiphase, but we have that ability. So going forward more with the dynamical systems perspective, we have this framework in which coordination can control and skill emerges from. And there are three components that are drawn from Newell's work that really are determinant upon our coordination and the ability for this system to work. And it's the intersection between the person or the organism constraint, the task constraint, which is whatever we are intending to do, and some sort of environmental information provided by our sensory feedback. Much of this is proprioception, much of it is hearing or auditory, and much of it is visual. So think about this, from a dynamical systems perspective, we have two limbs, and these are seen as your effectors. From the traditional idea with dynamical systems, they're looking at things that are often in cyclical motion. It's a very constrained movement pattern going around. So when we talk about dynamical systems of the human body, we often have to do things that are known patterns in running and in walking. Are two that we talk about, center mass, but also the segments, knees, and joints through the process. Now, the order parameter is the global parameter that captures the behavior of these two effector systems. Now, this theory opposes a little bit of the GMP with the central agent orchestrating the coordination. So it going to go higher order. It doesn't stay within the locations of the parameters that are located within GMP. So there's this idea that practice and experience with information allow us to constrain our movement patterns through the process, and this leads to our coordinated movement. So the ability for us to keep practicing, it trains us to have the ability to constrain degrees of freedom versus have freely movable degrees of freedom. All right, so now when we talk about dynamic systems, we're going to talk about two different forms of calculating the coordination, and keep in mind that this goes back to the angle. So we're calculating the angle of coordination between two oscillators, and they can be segments or they can be angles, and either one, because a segment does have an angle to the right horizontal. It's an absolute angle versus a relative angle, which is a joint angle. But the two we're going to talk about are the modified vector coding, or VC, and those are looking at angle plots, so angle of one effector or oscillator compared to the other one. And you also have CRP, continuous relative phase, also known as CRP, which takes the angular position and the angular velocity normalized plots of the two independent effectors, calculates the phase angle from that, and then compares those to create the angle of identification. So here's your vector coding, here's your CRP. If you look, here's effector 1, the thigh angle, here's effector 2, the shank angle, and it's a plot, angle plot there for you. The difference is here in the CRP, you have a normalized angular velocity, normalized angle. So this is theta, this is a W. And so what you're doing here is you're calculating the phase angle from a phase plot of the individual. The phase angle will be calculated here or versus calculating the phase angle here and then subtracting. So modified vector coding is simply taking the angle between, so each one of these data points. So if you look here, you have the 3 rows of data points like that go onto here. And so if I go from data point 1 to data point 2 to data point 3, I'm taking the angle that's created by the line, the vector that connects them to the right horizontal. And so my phase angle here is calculated, or the vector coding angle is calculated as the difference or the angle created between the 2 data points. The difference in the continuous relative phase is we're going to go back to this phase angle, this phase plot, and calculate the phase angle first of each of the individuals. And here the phase angle is, if this is my data point, we're going to draw a vector back to the origin, and the angle that we create, the phase angle, is the angle created between the right horizontal. So now what we're going to do is, if this is my thigh, I would calculate the phase angle of that. I would also do the same for the shank and for whatever, and then I would subtract those together, and that would give me here our CRP angle, which is our angle of coordination. And remember that if they are at 0, they are in phase. The further away from 0 they go, the more anti-phase they are. To 180s are complete anti-phase. Now, when we look at coordination work, there are 2 kind of components that we look at. That is, are they in phase or anti-phase? But there's also a component of variability. And the idea is that we have the ability, through constraining degrees of freedom or utilizing degrees of freedom, and how we control those degrees of freedom to make things more variable. And a lot of this comes into play with endurance running research and some other things, where we believe that the healthy state has a health of variability to it. Now, this is pattern variability. This is not going back to module 1 where we talked about endpoint variability and how we measured that endpoint error, right? So a lot of that variability from module 1 talked about the endpoint. And this is talking about how we generate patterns, because if we continue to move the exact same way and load our structure the same way constantly, then we are putting ourselves up to overuse. And well, at least that is the theory behind what we're talking about. So the idea is that we have a healthy state of variability, especially during transition states. So one of the studies that we look at, this is a healthy runner. This is a runner that has been diagnosed with patellofemoral pain. So you see areas of these transitions to swing and just before stance, and then the patterns through here that you have a little bit of difference in variability between a person that has been diagnosed with an overuse injury versus somebody who has not. Now, keep in mind, this is not saying that if you have these changes in variability, then you are going to be injured. This is somebody who's injured versus somebody who's not. We still do not know what the healthy range of variability is.